Welcome back to the Lost File, where the shadows are deeper than they seem, and the truth is rarely what it pretends to be. Today, we take you to a quiet stretch of western Pennsylvania, to a small town where the air always seemed too still and smiles lingered a little too long. A town called Milbrook. On the surface, it was nothing more than a postcard, a patchwork of tidy lawns, weather-worn porches, and churches that echoed with the same hymns for over a century. But behind one set of painted shutters, in a house set too far back from the road, was a family unlike any other, or at least that's what the papers said. This is the story of Howard and Margaret Folling and the 12 children they adopted over 15 years. Children who had no birth certificates, no hospital records, no legal trail at all. It all begins in the spring of 1978. Howard and Margaret arrived in Milbrook like characters from a book the town didn't remember reading. They were older than most new arrivals. He was in his early 40s, a sharp-jawed man with a slicked-back haircut and briefcases that never seemed to open. Margaret was pale, well-dressed, always wearing gloves even in summer, her movements precise like a dancer or a doll. They moved into a house the townspeople called the Hollow Hill Place, a Victorian mansion abandoned since the 60s, left to rot under the slow suffocation of ivy and dust. Locals whispered about the house for years. Kids dared each other to throw stones at its windows. Dogs refused to go near the fence. And then, one day, it wasn't empty anymore. Howard claimed to be a retired investment banker from Pittsburgh. Margaret had once been a pediatric nurse, though no one in Milbrook ever saw her work again. What they did see, however, was a miracle. A sad, childless couple, finally bringing a baby home. The first adoption happened in 1980. A boy, about 6 months old, named James. The entire town gathered on Elm Street to celebrate. There were balloons, casseroles, and a banner in the church that read, "A blessing at last." No one asked where the baby had come from. No one asked which agency had placed him. They were just happy for the Follings. They wanted to believe. But it didn't stop there. By 1985, the Follings had 5 children, then 8, then 11. And still, not a single child had been seen registering for school, visiting a doctor's office, or attending any town events without their parents present. They were homeschooled, Margaret said. Private, sensitive. Shy children need protection, she would say. And somehow that explanation made people feel comforted, even if it never truly answered anything. Some neighbors tried to get close. Others quietly pulled away. One of the only people to cross the invisible line was Elaine Winters, who lived directly across from the Follings for 20 years. She was the first to notice the way Margaret watched her children. Not with affection, but with a sharp, possessive stillness. She'd sit on that porch for hours, Elaine said later. Didn't rock in the chair, didn't wave, just stared, like she was memorizing something. And the children? They were too quiet, too clean, too obedient. Not once did any of them shout, cry, or run through the yard like the other kids on Elm Street. They followed Margaret like shadows, dressed alike, hair neatly parted, smiling only when spoken to. They didn't look scared. Not really. Just emptied out. It wasn't long before people started whispering, but only when the Follings were out of earshot. How had they adopted so many so fast? Why weren't the children allowed friends? Why didn't any of them have birthdays? The first major crack appeared in 1987. Thomas, the Follings' 3rd child, fell from a tree in the backyard and broke his arm. Neighbors heard the screams, sharp, panicked, but Margaret didn't call for help. Didn't take him to the hospital. A week later, the boy was rushed into emergency surgery at Milbrook General after developing a severe infection. The attending doctor, Sarah Chen, noted that the child didn't cry once. even during the procedure. And when asked what happened, Thomas looked at his father first. Only when Howard gave a small nod did the boy respond, I fell. I wasn't careful." Dr. Chen grew suspicious. When she asked for medical records, Howard claimed they'd been lost in a fire at the adoption agency. No agency name, no paperwork, just apologies. Stern ones, threatening ones. Chen filed a report with Child Protective Services. A caseworker named David Morris visited the Follings, walked their halls, met the children. He found nothing alarming. The house was clean. The children were polite. Margaret offered tea and wept softly about the burden of being misunderstood. The case was closed 3 weeks later, and Milbrook forgot, or rather, pretended to. The Follings adopted 3 more children between 1988 and 1990, Robert, Anne, and Henry. That made 11. The Follings adopted 3 more children between 1988 and 1990, Robert, Anne, and Henry. That made 11. 11 perfectly behaved children in a house no one was allowed to enter. Children who didn't wave, didn't whisper, didn't age, at least not in any way people could measure. And then came the Fletchers. In the winter of 1992, Michael and Susan Fletcher moved into a small home just 4 doors down from the Follings. He was a journalist. She was a social worker with a background in child welfare. And unlike the townsfolk, Susan didn't shrug off what she saw. Her teenage daughter, Emily, would later recall how her mother watched the falling children like she'd seen ghosts wearing skin. They flinched at sudden movements. They never made eye contact, and whenever Margaret entered the room, they sat up straighter. Not out of respect, but something closer to fear. Susan began documenting what she observed. She kept detailed notes, dates, names, patterns. She tried to befriend Margaret, even managed a few visits inside the house. It was during one of those visits that she heard something strange. Crying. From upstairs, behind a locked door. Margaret told her the house made strange noises. "Old pipes," she laughed, but Susan had worked in too many shelters to buy that story. The final straw came in the spring of 1993. Susan saw a face in the attic window, a child she didn't recognize. Long, dark hair, pale, wide-eyed. The girl vanished behind the curtains in an instant, but Susan had already met all 11 of the Folling children, and that was not one of them. At the same time, Michael was working on an article series about adoption fraud. Specifically, how several shady agencies across state lines had been shut down in the 80s for placing undocumented children. His notes revealed something strange. The timeline of those agencies' closures aligned perfectly with the Follings' earliest adoptions. When the Follings announced they were adopting again, this time, twin boys named Peter and Paul, and a girl named Mary. Susan's concern turned to dread. She told Michael, "They're not adopting, they're collecting." But she wouldn't live to see what came next. In the fall of 1994, Susan Fletcher was diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer. By early 1995, she was on hospice care. But before her death, she summoned someone to her bedside. A young detective named Richard Cooper. She gave him a folder, dozens of pages, photos, journals, questions. She said, "I don't have time to convince the town, but you might." Susan Fletcher died on June 12, 1995, and what she left behind would set off a chain of events that shattered the illusion of Milbrook and revealed what the Follings were really hiding. To understand the horror of the Folling household, you need to start with the children, not as they appeared in photographs, dressed neatly and lined up like catalog dolls, but as they existed. Because what you saw wasn't real. What you saw was something curated, something trained, like animals at a show, reciting the lines they'd been fed, performing the illusion of a perfect family. There were 12 of them in total, 11 by official count, and one ghost who peered from a third-floor window like a slip of a secret too stubborn to stay buried. Their names, as recorded, were James, Elizabeth, Thomas, Catherine, William, Robert, Anne, Henry, Peter, Paul, and Mary. No birthdays were ever celebrated. No medical files ever followed them. No schools ever confirmed their enrollment. But each one of them had a room in that towering house on Elm Street. Each one had their own role, their own rules, their own corner of the performance. Those who tried to get close described the children as polite, distant, and eerily quiet. But those who saw them, really saw them, used words like off, detached, and vacant. They didn't act like siblings. They didn't even act like children. Clara Jenkins, a retired Sunday school teacher, remembered the Sunday services vividly. They sat in a perfect row. Not a single one fidgeted. Not a cough, not a whisper. They never looked at each other, only straight ahead. I've taught hundreds of kids over the years, and I'd never seen anything like it. It wasn't discipline. It was something else, something rehearsed. The Follings had turned their family into a script, and the children were memorizing every line. According to testimony gathered later, the rules within the Folling household weren't just strict. They were labyrinthine, contradictory, ever-shifting, and enforced with cold precision. The children were forbidden from speaking unless spoken to, forbidden from asking questions, forbidden from entering each other's rooms. Even eye contact between siblings was discouraged, and worst of all, they were never to refer to Howard and Margaret as Mom or Dad. They were to be addressed only as Sir and Madame. Former housekeeper Maria Vasquez, one of the only staff members to later testify, described the environment as a living museum. Everything in the house was in its place. Children moved like they were walking through a maze they'd memorized. Margaret's word was law, but it wasn't the kind of law you'd find in any household rule book. It was ritualistic. They weren't punished like normal kids, Vasquez said. They weren't yelled at or grounded. They were made to confess, made to repent. It was like watching a church service where only one person knew the rules. Margaret had a system she called the correction. Each child had a small, leather-bound journal in which they were required to record their daily transgressions, things like thinking unclean thoughts or forgetting to bow before entering the dining room. At the end of each day, Margaret would review the journals. Those who had failed to account for themselves were subjected to isolation. But this wasn't normal time out. The children were sent to what Margaret called the room of reflection, a locked closet beneath the stairwell lined with mirrors. They were required to remain inside for hours, often overnight, with a single dim bulb illuminating their own reflection in every direction. Maria remembered hearing the children whispering prayers inside. Not prayers like I knew them, she said. They were reciting lines, names, numbers, over and over. But the most unsettling element of the household was what happened on Sundays after church, after the family returned from their silent row at the front pew. That was when Margaret would conduct what she called the ritual of graces. It happened in the parlor, which was off limits to all staff. Maria, though forbidden, once peeked through the keyhole. They were all kneeling, she recalled, trembling. Margaret stood in front of them, reading from a thick black book, not a Bible, something older, something handwritten. The children repeated her words. She would draw symbols on their foreheads with some kind of dark red liquid, and then she'd place a silver bowl in front of each child. They'd drink from it, every single one. Maria would later find those bowls stored in a locked cabinet, silver-plated, etched with symbols she didn't recognize. When she asked Margaret about them, she was dismissed immediately and warned not to ask again. She quit shortly afterward. Years later, those bowls would be found again during the official search of the home, along with Margaret's handwritten manuscripts, her journals, and pages upon pages of her invented scripture. Psychologists called it a form of personal myth-making, a fantasy system imposed so completely upon vulnerable children that it became real to them. But some details don't fit so neatly into clinical terms, like the drawings. When the 3 hidden children from the 3rd floor were finally removed and placed into care, they were unable to speak English fluently. But what they could do was draw. Crude, unsettling images repeated over and over in their therapy sessions. They drew a tall woman in a black dress holding a cup. They drew a room with no windows, lined with candles and symbols. And again, they drew an eye above a doorway, an eye over a crib, an eye sewn into a dress. It wasn't until agents searched the Folling home that the symbols began to connect. Behind the children's headboards were markings, carved deep into the wood, resembling ancient protective sigils. In Margaret's journals, those same symbols appeared beside what she referred to as binding rites and severance ceremonies. It was clear Margaret hadn't simply adopted these children. She had claimed them like relics or vessels. Dr. Evelyn Maroro, a child psychologist assigned to the case, believed that Margaret had constructed an elaborate system of belief in which she was the sole spiritual authority. It was a delusion, Maroro said, but a dangerously infectious one. These children had never known another reality. Margaret had isolated them not only physically, but psychologically. Even the names the children were given appeared in Margaret's writings long before the adoptions occurred. It was as if she had preordained them. James, the messenger; Elizabeth, the chosen mirror; Thomas, the bound voice. Each child had a role in her system. Each child was named not for who they were, but for what she needed them to be. The rituals grew more intense as the years passed. One child, a boy listed as Peter, began to resist. At age 12, he tried to run away. He was caught less than a mile down the road and brought back by Howard. That night, according to a neighbor, lights remained on in the 3rd floor windows until well past dawn. Peter didn't appear at church again for 6 months. When he did return, his head was shaved and he walked with a limp. He never looked anyone in the eye again. No charges were ever filed. No complaints were ever submitted. The town had grown silent, complicit, and yet something deeper had taken root, something older than Margaret. Because buried within her journals, beneath the layers of invented scripture, were references to symbols and practices that didn't originate with her. Some of the sigils matched early Appalachian folklore. Others resembled protective marks used by mid-20th century spiritualist cults, but one passage stood out. The vessel must be severed from the former name. To erase the bloodline is to make the child new. They must know only the eye, only the grace, only the order. It wasn't a game. It wasn't therapy. It was indoctrination. Complete erasure followed by rebirth into something Margaret controlled absolutely. The children weren't missing on paper. They were missing in spirit. And by the time Detective Cooper had taken Susan Fletcher's file and begun peeling back the layers, it was already too late for many of them to remember who they really were. The Follings didn't build a family. They built an altar. By the summer of 1995, the secrets inside the Folling house had become too heavy to stay buried. The town of Milbrook, long held under the hush of polite indifference, was beginning to stir, though the real reckoning came not from within, but from the bedside of a dying woman. Susan Fletcher had been a social worker for over 2 decades. She'd seen what trauma looked like in children, how it crept into their posture, their silence, their flinches. From the moment she moved to Elm Street, she knew something was wrong with the Folling kids. But it wasn't until she started gathering notes, long, meticulous records of strange behavior, inconsistencies in their stories, and symbols she didn't understand, that she realized this wasn't just a troubled household. It was something else, something structured. By the time breast cancer had confined her to a hospice bed, Susan had compiled a file thick with her observations. There were photos, blurry snapshots of the falling children standing like mannequins in the yard, timelines of suspicious adoption dates, diagrams of the house's windows, even a list of ritualistic phrases Margaret had spoken during their coffee meetings, often muttered under her breath. And there was one final note, scrawled in red ink across a piece of hotel stationery. "There is a child they won't name. I saw her in the attic window. She doesn't match any photo." Susan didn't trust the Milbrook Police Department, but she trusted one man, Detective Richard Cooper, a quiet, persistent officer who had grown up in Milbrook and once attended church with the Follings. Cooper wasn't just a cop. He was someone who listened. So when Susan called him to her bedside, he came without hesitation. She was skeletal by then, Cooper recalled later, but her eyes were sharp. There was no confusion. She said, "They're keeping more than children in that house. They're keeping secrets that don't belong to them." He took the file, promising to investigate, but even Cooper underestimated what he was walking into. At first, he did what any cautious investigator would do. He verified, cross-referenced, dug quietly. The Follings were powerful. Howard was on the board of the local historical society, a generous donor to the town library, and a personal friend of the mayor. Cooper knew any misstep could cost him the case before it started. His first move was to check the adoption records, and immediately, things didn't add up. The Follings had adopted children from 5 different agencies across 3 states: Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. Several of those agencies had since shut down under allegations of poor record keeping, or in one case, illegal placements. But what stood out was the speed. Adoptions that should have taken years happened in a matter of months. In some cases, weeks. Even stranger, each adoption was followed by a large donation from Howard Falling, anywhere between $10,000 and $50,000. To the agency involved? Legal? Technically, yes. Common? Absolutely not. Cooper began to trace the paper trail, only to find that many of the agencies no longer existed. Offices had closed, directors had vanished, entire case files had been lost in floods or misfiled into oblivion. One clerk told Cooper, off the record, that some of the agencies had been black market adjacent, not outright trafficking rings, but not exactly above board either. Cooper was stunned. They weren't just adopting, he later told investigators. They were curating, looking for specific kinds of children, ones who wouldn't be missed, ones who could disappear. But suspicions weren't enough. He needed testimony. He needed eyes on the inside. So he drove, alone, to a small Ohio town where he'd traced Maria Vasquez, the former Falling housekeeper. She'd left Milbrook in 1991, shortly after the incident with young James and the punishment in the corner. So he drove, alone, to a small Ohio town where he'd traced Maria Vasquez, the former Falling housekeeper. She'd left Milbrook in 1991, shortly after the incident with young James and the punishment in the corner. Cooper found her living under her maiden name, working in a bakery. At first, she refused to speak. Then he showed her Susan Fletcher's file. She went pale, he remembered. She said, "So someone else saw it. I thought I imagined it all." Then she started talking, and didn't stop for 3 hours. Maria described the household in chilling detail. The journals, the punishments, the room of reflection, the 3 locked doors on the 3rd floor where she left food, never seeing the children inside, only hearing their cries. She remembered Margaret's rituals, the markings on the children, the strange language spoken on Sunday evenings, and perhaps most disturbing, the way Howard would sit, stone-faced, through it all, never interfering. He wasn't passive, she said. He was in agreement. Everything they did as one. Armed with Susan's file and Maria's testimony, Cooper brought his findings to his superior, Chief Raymond Wallace. The response was immediate. "Drop it," Wallace said. Cooper stared, stunned. "Sir, we have credible evidence." "I said drop it." Wallace folded his hands. "The Follings are private citizens. Respected, philanthropic. Without hard evidence of a crime, we don't snoop around in their affairs." Cooper knew then what Susan must have known. The town was compromised. Whether by loyalty, fear, or favor, the system wouldn't protect the children. Not here. So he went rogue. He moved his notes out of the station and into his own home, began conducting unofficial interviews at night. Teachers, neighbors, former staff. He called in favors from contacts in the state police and child protective services, and that's when another thread unraveled. One he hadn't expected. Emily Fletcher, 19 years old, studying journalism at Penn State, Susan's daughter. She had continued her mother's investigation. Emily had spent hours combing through online databases, old newspapers, missing children bulletins from 1980 to 1995. What she discovered was harrowing. In at least 3 cases, a child had gone missing from the same counties where the Follings had adopted another. In every instance, the child who disappeared was poor, undocumented, or came from a vulnerable background. And the disappearances happened within weeks of a Folling adoption. Emily had even created a color-coded timeline, mapping out the coincidences. She handed it to Cooper in a sealed folder. He remembered feeling nauseous as he read. "It wasn't an accident," she told him. "They were shopping." The final piece came from an unexpected source, a janitor at Milbrook General Hospital. He remembered something strange from years ago when Thomas Folling had come in with a compound fracture. The attending physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, had requested medical records. There were none. Howard Folling claimed they'd been destroyed in a fire at the adoption agency. The janitor overheard an argument between Chen and the hospital director. Chen insisted on filing a CPS report. The director refused. Later, Chen left the hospital, quietly, transferred out of state. Cooper reached out to her. She remembered everything. "They brought in a boy who looked hollow," she told him. "His body was there, but his spirit wasn't. And when I asked about his records, Howard threatened to sue the hospital." Now Cooper had what he needed. Susan's file, Emily's timeline, Maria's testimony, Dr. Chen's refusal to falsify records. He bypassed Chief Wallace and took it all to the Pennsylvania State Police. His contact was Lisa Harper, a former colleague now assigned to a child exploitation task force. She read the report in one night. The next morning, she called Cooper. "We're going in." The raid was scheduled for October 23rd, 1995. A convoy of unmarked vehicles would arrive at dawn. Agents from the Department of Justice's Child Exploitation Division would accompany state troopers. Cooper would serve as liaison and local contact. But something unnerved him. He had a feeling, deep in his gut, that the Follings knew. And they did. When officers knocked, Howard answered in a silk robe, calm and smiling. He invited them in. Margaret, on the other hand, was unhinged, screaming, scratching, speaking in tongues. It took 2 officers to restrain her. Upstairs, they found the 11 children, dressed, sitting straight, not reacting. But on the 3rd floor, behind 3 locked doors, they found what had been hidden. 3 children, malnourished, silent, terrified. No names, no records, no voices left. The Follings had crafted a family not out of love, but out of silence, control, and something far darker than anyone in Milbrook had dared imagine. The investigation had only just begun. The arrest of Howard and Margaret Folling shocked Milbrook to its core. For nearly 2 decades, the town had revered the couple. They were models of generosity and class, saviors of lost children, patrons of the arts, and the kind of people who lit candles in church for other people's tragedies. But once the 3rd floor doors were opened and the 3 hidden children were found, the narrative shifted. In hushed voices behind closed doors, people began using other words: cult, brainwashing, rituals, evil. But none of those words were official. The charges at first were standard: felony child endangerment, unlawful imprisonment, and obstruction of justice. The FBI and Pennsylvania State Police moved quickly, locking down the Falling estate and placing the children, both known and hidden, into emergency protective custody. But what investigators were about to discover in the coming weeks was something beyond criminality. It wasn't just a pattern of abuse. It was a belief system, one that had been quietly governing the Falling household for years. The key to unlocking this doctrine came, surprisingly, from a study. Howard's study, to be precise. Behind a locked cabinet inside a bookshelf that had been built into the wall, agents found a false panel. Inside were 4 leather-bound volumes with no titles on the spine. They were filled with notes, dense handwriting, diagrams, and passages copied from obscure 19th century spiritual texts. Some were in English, others were in Latin, and some were in a language that didn't appear to exist at all. The FBI brought in linguists and cult specialists to examine the material. One investigator later described it as a hybrid of biblical literalism, ritualistic asceticism, and folk mysticism. At the center of it all was a term that appeared repeatedly across the pages: the hollowing. No one in law enforcement had seen the term used this way before. In the Follings writings, it was treated as both a practice and a state of being. Children, the doctrine claimed, were born imperfect vessels, tainted by the sins of their bloodlines. Through careful discipline, spiritual stripping, and obedience, they could be hollowed, emptied of self, so that a higher essence might one day inhabit them. The doctrine taught that Margaret was the handmaid of refinement. Howard referred to himself only as the steward. Together, they were tasked with preparing the 12 for what the writings ominously called the arrival. Each child had a corresponding entry in one of the volumes. Not names, never names. Instead, they were given titles like the Listener, the Quiet Flame, or the 10th Vessel. Their personalities were reduced to symbols: squares for obedience, circles for passivity, X's for defiance. Some pages had red ink stamped across them, labeled fractured or not viable. Of the 3 hidden children discovered on the 3rd floor, only one had a complete page. He was labeled the Echo. His page was filled with disturbing detail: how he didn't cry for 3 days, how he mimicked Margaret's every movement, how he would sit in perfect stillness for hours when told. Below these notes, a handwritten line read, "Will accept voice," marked at the brow. "Do not overfeed." The symbols, the language, the locked doors. For child psychologist Dr. Evelyn Maroro, it was confirmation of what she already feared. The abuse had become ritualized. And the rituals weren't just physical, they were psychological and spiritual. The children weren't raised, they were reconditioned. When questioned, the 11 officially adopted children spoke in patterns. Identical phrases, identical syntax. Sir and Madame provide all that we need. The world outside is unclean. We are prepared for service. They spoke as if rehearsing lines from a play only they could see. Dr. Maroro tried everything: talk therapy, art therapy, even music. But it took weeks to unravel even the most basic sense of individuality. The children didn't refer to themselves by their legal names. They referred to each other by numbers. "I am 5th, one boy said. "She is 3rd. Another girl responded to the name Little Hollow. It wasn't just trauma, it was indoctrination. Then came the drawings. During a session with one of the hidden children, a boy believed to be around 8 years old, Dr. Maroro handed him a blank sheet of paper and a crayon. He drew a triangle with an eye in the center, surrounded by flames. Inside the triangle were stick figures, kneeling. When asked what it was, the boy whispered a single word: listening. Other children began to produce similar symbols, circles with slashes through them, black suns, eyes without pupils. One child drew a staircase, ascending into darkness. Another drew a woman with no face but a crown of thorns. These symbols appeared repeatedly in the books found in the study. The children weren't simply exposed to these ideas. They had been taught them. The question investigators kept circling was why? Why would a wealthy couple with access to privilege and power create a belief system so rooted in secrecy and submission? The answer, in part, seemed to come from Margaret's journals, recovered from a locked trunk in her bedroom. These were more emotional than Howard's writings. Rambling, obsessive. They spoke of voices, the three that speak behind the curtain, of dreams where she floated above the house, hearing children crying from underground, of a fractured veil between worlds, and most frequently, of a being she called Mother Without Mouth. The entries described visions where this Mother would instruct Margaret to prepare pure vessels for her descent, to remove identity, desire, and memory, to quiet the body and mind, and most disturbingly, to orphan the soul. There were prayers written to this mother, chants, recipes for what Margaret called the sleep tincture, a blend of herbs and animal bile, likely used to sedate the children. A separate notebook listed trials Margaret had conducted: fasting, sensory deprivation, mirror isolation. The more investigators read, the more apparent it became. Margaret wasn't just controlling these children. She believed she was cleansing them. Howard, during his early interrogations, remained cold but cooperative. He claimed that the books were fiction, that the journals were therapeutic. When asked about the children in the attic, he said they were mentally fragile and required quiet. It wasn't until day 4 of questioning that something cracked. When asked about the hollowing, Howard became visibly agitated. He began to speak in fragments. "It's not finished," he muttered. "She's not here yet." When pressed to elaborate, he whispered, "The veil hasn't torn. She's waiting." After that, he refused to speak again. Margaret, meanwhile, spoke only in what appeared to be her invented language. She would rock back and forth, eyes wide, murmuring syllables that made no sense to anyone. It wasn't until she saw a photograph of one of the children, the girl labeled The Flame, that she began to scream. "She's not ready!" Margaret shrieked. "The hollow isn't clean." Then she began speaking English again, long enough to deliver one final chilling sentence. "You've broken the circle. She'll come crooked now." As prosecutors prepared to file additional charges, ranging from kidnapping to human trafficking to unlawful imprisonment, they faced an eerie obstacle. None of the children had legal birth certificates. There was no record of their existence prior to entering the Follings' custody. The adoption papers were forged. Their real names, families, even places of origin, unknown. They were, in every legal sense, nobody. And that was exactly how the Follings wanted them. A forensic team swept the Falling estate for hidden compartments, old photographs, anything that could establish the children's identities. Deep beneath the basement, behind a false wall in the wine cellar, they found a wooden box sealed with wax. Inside were personal items: baby shoes, bracelets with hospital tags, Polaroids. Most were labeled with dates, many with initials. Some bore small notches, X carved into the frame. Every child had one. They weren't just children, they were inventory. By the end of 1995, a clearer picture had emerged. The Follings had built a closed ecosystem of obedience, a house where children were not nurtured, but systematically erased. Their doctrine, crafted from fragments of religion, hallucination, and control, served one purpose: to create the hollowed. But the question remained: to what end? What was the arrival? Who or what was Mother Without Mouth? And why did it have to be 12? Those answers would arrive soon enough, and when they did, they would shatter more than just silence. They would shatter reality. The trial of Howard and Margaret Folling began in the winter of 1996, but long before opening arguments were made, the story had already taken root in the public consciousness. Newspapers called it the Hollow House Trial. Talk radio speculated wildly about cults, satanic rituals, mind control. And yet, much of the case remained sealed, the more esoteric elements of the Follings' beliefs kept from public view. Not because they weren't relevant, but because they were too disturbing. Despite facing 47 felony charges, Howard Folling remained composed throughout. Margaret, on the other hand, was declared mentally unfit to stand trial. After several violent outbursts and a prolonged hunger strike, she was transferred to a state psychiatric facility where she remained under heavy sedation. But the real mystery wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the children. In the months following the arrest, the 11 known Folling children were placed into a specialized recovery program. Progress was slow. Most still responded only to numbers or coded phrases. When asked their names, several simply said, "I am hollow." But something strange began happening. During sessions with Dr. Maroro, the children would sometimes draw the same image over and over, a door in a wall of darkness. Always the same door, arched, wooden, etched with symbols. In every drawing, it was slightly ajar. One child, the girl previously labeled Little Hollow, began waking in the night, speaking in the same glossolalic language Margaret had used. But unlike Margaret's frenzied mutterings, the girl's tone was calm, almost measured. She would sit up in bed and whisper phrases like, "3 are missing. The gate counts 12. She knows we are not yet ready. And once, the crooked one has entered." This behavior wasn't isolated. 3 months after their rescue, one of the hidden children, the boy called the Echo, slipped away from his foster placement in the middle of the night. When found 12 hours later, barefoot and shivering in a nearby park, he was drawing symbols into the dirt with a stick, over and over, circles with thorns, eyes with bleeding pupils, crescent moons inside squares. When asked what he was doing, he said, "Marking the way back." Back to what? No one could answer that. And then there were the sightings. In early 1997, several former neighbors reported seeing candlelight flickering inside the boarded-up Folling estate. Police searched the property twice. Nothing. Then, in April, a local teenager who broke in on a dare claimed to have heard singing coming from the 3rd floor. The house had been empty for over a year. When officers responded, they found no one inside. But in the attic, above the 3rd floor, a space no one had searched before, they found something else. Scrawled across the beams in what appeared to be dried blood were these words: "She was promised 12. And beneath it, scratched into the floorboards, "The gate is open." After this discovery, the state moved to demolish the property. It was razed in the summer of 1997. But when the wrecking crew brought down the eastern wing, workers unearthed a shallow pit beneath the foundation, previously undetected. Inside were remains, not bones, just clothes, tiny shoes, blankets, hospital bracelets. Some were buried alongside small dolls wrapped in cloth. One forensic analyst described it as a mock burial ground. None of the items matched the known children. It was now clear the Follings had taken in more than 12. How many more? That remains unknown. In a closed federal hearing, prosecutors introduced the writings discovered in Howard's study, excerpts from the Hollow Doctrine, Margaret's journals, and an unfinished letter addressed simply to the one who will finish it. The letter's contents were haunting. Howard wrote of how the children were chosen to be vessels, that they must remain nameless, rootless, and hollowed by silence. He claimed Margaret received divine instruction from a being who existed between this world and the one beneath. He ended the letter with the line, "When the 12th vessel is broken, she will arrive, full and screaming." The court never released that letter to the public. Howard Follings was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms without parole. He never spoke again in prison. He was found dead in his cell in 2003. No signs of trauma, no suicide note. Just one thing, on the wall of his cell he had written in pencil, "She is still coming." Margaret remained institutionalized until 2011, when she too died during a night of reported seizures and speaking in tongues. Nurses say her final words were, "She walks now, but not straight." Of the surviving children, 6 have since changed their names and built quiet lives far from Milbrook. 3 remain under psychiatric care. 2 disappeared in adulthood. No contact, no traces. And the 3 hidden children, they were never identified. Their DNA matched no known registries, no missing persons cases. It was as if they were born inside that house, or taken from places that never filed reports. One of them, the girl, still draws the door, always slightly open. The house is gone, but the land is still there, untouched, unsold. Local kids say you can still hear crying if you get too close to the old tree line. Some say it's just the wind, others say it's the gate. Still waiting, still counting. This has been The Lost File. Until next time, remember, some homes weren't built to be lived in. They were built to wait, and wait, and wait.